Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Tonight, we'll be discussing an essay by Ayn Rand called What is Capitalism? It was published in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. And to discuss this essay, we have with us Don Watkins. Don is the author of the co-author of Free Market Revolution: How Ayn Rand's Ideas Can End Big Government, Equal is Unfair: America's Misguided Fight Against Income Inequality, and most recently in 2017, In Pursuit of Wealth: The Moral Case for Finance. And we also have James Valliant. James Valliant wrote recently the book Creating Christ. So thanks again for joining Don and James. I would like also to remind people on YouTube, watching us on YouTube, that they can send their questions there while we're discussing, and we'll try to bring them up during our discussion. And also, if they want their questions to be prioritized, they can turn them into super chats. Finally, if you want to support the work that we do at the Ayn Rand Center.co, at the Ayn Rand Center, please go to aynrandcenter.co.uk/memberships and become members. So, starting with the essay, I had read it many years ago and recently just revisited it for this call. And the beginning of it really made me reminisce of my years in university when I was studying economics, because it really did strike a nerve when the essay describes how political economists view man. And I'm going to read a quote from the essay, from maybe the second page of the essay, which explains what I'm trying to say here. Political economists, including the advocates of capitalism, defined their science as the study of the management or direction or organization or manipulation of a community's or a nation's resources. The nature of these resources was not defined, their communal ownership was taken for granted, and the goal of political economy was assumed to be the study of how to utilize these resources for the common good. And later, further down, explains in more detail, man was regarded simply as one of the factors of production, along with land, forests, or mines, as one of the less significant factors, since more study devoted to the influence and quality of these others than to his role or quality. Now, I maybe studied economics within a standard kind of university setting, but do we know if there are any political economists that do not follow this traditional view of man as a resource and do not consider the resources as a kind of there to serve the common good? And if so, who would these economists be? Don or James, do you know any such economists?
Well,
If they're not, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, James.
If they're not directly influenced by Ayn Rand, no, I'm not familiar with them. The best economists outside of those directly influenced by Ayn Rand, Austrian economists, very much fall into this. Take Nobel laureate F.A. Hayek. He very much views the economy in this collectivist way. And what's good for the community or society is really the standard for him. It's not, he doesn't approach it methodologically as an individualist or morally as an individualist at all. To him, it's a question of what's good for the species, really, what's good for society. It's almost an evolutionary argument, a la Herbert Spencer, a little bit more sophisticated and using spontaneous order stuff from Austrian economics. But even the best economists, like the Austrians, will rest on a utilitarian or sort of collectivist justification, just as Ayn Rand described.
Yeah, I mean, I would caveat that slightly. So I agree with James. It's particularly whenever they're trying to give a justification or an argument for it that they'll fall into that. But one thing I would recommend to people who are interested in this in kind of its most technical detail and greatest depth, there's a really great article by Rob Tarr in what's it called, Foundations of a Free Society, where he argues that the fundamental approach of the Austrians to understanding the key concept in economics, the concept of value, is very tightly aligned with the objectivist one. And they have a very individualistic perspective on value that you don't get in any of the other schools. But James is certainly right that Hayek is in many ways an exception, but even beyond Hayek, whenever they're turning to justification. So it's not just this is how economics works, but this is why capitalism is good. Then it all gets put into collectivist terms.
Yeah. I even remember one phrase that is not maybe exact, but I remember reading it in one of my books, that economics is the art of trying to allocate limited resources to satisfy unlimited needs or wants, implying that everyone's needs and wants are equally valued. And the economist's job is to find a way to support all the needs of all the people, because that is the objective. Now, on the second phrase, though, man was regarded simply as one of the factors of production. Is it not missing that economics also view man as a consumer? For example, there's theories on demand elasticity, on like the demand side of things. Yes, on the supply side, man is wrongly viewed as a resource, but don't you think that this may be also kind of the consumer side of a man could be construed as being more individualistic?
I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the question is. I mean, I think it's helpful to see what she's doing in this essay kind of at a high level. So the last time I was on this show with Jim, we talked about philosophy, who needs it. And one of the points we made was that her view is that philosophy is important because we're always making certain assumptions about the nature of reality, about how we know it, and about good and evil. And part of the nature of reality is the basic nature of man. And I think what we're seeing in this essay is she's arguing that there's certain assumptions being made that prevent people from even understanding what capitalism is and why it functions. I mean, that should be really striking to us, right? Here's an essay called "What is Capitalism?" Like, that seems like, well, doesn't everybody know what it is? And her view is like, you don't even have a clue of what it is. So it's not just that you're wrong about, you think that it's bad and it's actually good. It's that you have no clue what it is. And the reason you don't have a clue what it is because you're getting all these fundamentals wrong. And so that I think that what is most striking about this essay is that it's how deep it is philosophically. It's that you don't have the right view of man, you don't have the right view of value, and that is completely obliterating your ability to understand things. And one aspect that's unique in how she understands a market and how she understands capitalism is precisely that her focus is on the producer. So I think that with economists, you'll often get, and people arguing for capitalism, it's, well, what we care about is consumers, and producers are just there to feed consumers, essentially, and they're servants of consumers. And one of the points she talks about, this is more in her essay, Egalitarianism and Inflation, is that there's no such thing as a consumer qua consumer. that it's what exists are producers, and then they're able to use the value that they've produced then to consume things. And that on a market, it's that's your demand, right? Your supply, you create a supply that then constitutes your demand for resources that other people have produced. And so that she would not want a sharp distinction drawn between, oh, well, if we are considering consumers, you're individualists. No, it's the individual is a producer, and it's only insofar as a producer he can consume.
Yeah, it's impossible to be a consumer without having produced anything, right? Because what are you going to exchange in order to consume?
And whether you look at people as muscles or mouths and stomachs really doesn't matter to the methodological individualism question, right? You can look at both in a collectivist way, right? Neither really imply individualism yet. Individual producers are all individuals, and so are consumers. I mean, they're only individuals, and that's really the point here. When you look at it from that perspective, qua consumer, qua right labor. They won't even use the word producer. Qua labor or qua consumer. You're looking at it right there from a pretty much collectivist perspective, rather than looking at it from the individualist, methodologically individualist perspective that Ayn Rand insists on. As Don says, it boils down for Ayn Rand to the nature of man. And that's the way you have to look at this. We have to look at it in terms of fundamental principles, according to Ayn Rand. When you start midstream, and that's really what her argument here is, that economics as a science really is starting midstream when it asks questions at that level. Right? She's trying to get underneath it. Right?
Yeah. Then a bit later in the essay, she starts providing an example of how capitalism is defined by Encyclopedia Britannica. So I'm going to read this quote, and it would be nice to discuss like how many things you can find wrong about this first paragraph. So capitalism, a term used to denote the economic system that has been dominant in the Western world since the breakup of feudalism. Fundamental to any system called capitalist are the relations between private owners of non-personal means of production, i.e. land, mines, industrial plants, etc., collectively known as capital, and free but capitalless workers who sell their labor services to employers. The resulting wage bargains determine the proportion in which the total product of society will be shared between the class of laborers and the class of capitalist entrepreneurs. My comment here when I was reading it is, I mean, mines, industrial plants, etc., capital. Who made them? Like the question is, who? Like, did they just appear out of nowhere? It forgets about that. And then also, capital. Like, how far do you go to call something capital? For example, if I own a hammer, do I belong now in the capital class, in the what is it called, in the capitalist entrepreneur class? And how little do you have to own in order to be classified as a laborer? But any other thoughts from you on this definition?
It's no definition at all, is it? It's a giant evasion, right? First, it starts with a historical accidental timing as some sort of essence to it, which is just historically wrong anyway. It doesn't even specify. It just says the system that dominated after feudalism. Well, that's just factually wrong, historically. And besides, it's a definition. It's not a definition. It's a definition by non-essentials, just a historical timing thing. No, but more than that, when it talks about, as you pointed out, labor, different classes, the capitalist class versus the labor class, it's walking in the door with a whole bunch of collectivist categories that transcend the individual, right? Have nothing really to do with the individual. It does look, just as we were saying before, at people as resources. and consumers. Basically, they're mouths and stomachs and muscles. And they're looked at in those categories rather than as individuals. There's nothing moral about it. There's nothing essential about the system of capitalism, the importance of private property, right? The role of freedom. Right? None of that's there. None of the essential features of capitalism, or even historically. So the definition obviously stinks and presumes a collectivist approach.
Right. Earlier on in this essay, there is a paragraph which compares American philosophy and European philosophy. And it states that the American philosophy of the rights of man was never grasped fully by European intellectuals. Europe's predominant idea of emancipation consisted of changing the concept of man as a slave of the absolute state embodied by a king to the concept of man as a slave to the absolute state embodied by the people. But I do not see there an example of how the American example was different, other than that the rights of man, the philosophy of the rights of man was never fully grasped. So would it be possible to provide us with an example of how different the USA was compared to, or the American example was compared to the European one? Don or James?
Yeah, I mean, public interest be damned.
Yeah.
It's true that the same basic morality that corrupts, European political thinking is corrupting American political thinking. It's altruism and collectivism, and it has the same essential root. The idea that America started with, though, was far more individualistic, right? And far more egoistic, the right of an individual to pursue his or her own happiness. That is an, egoistic, individualistic sort of approach, and a moral approach too. You have a right to it. In effect, that really never sunk in Europe, is what Ayn Rand is arguing. That in effect, the collectivist approaches, whether it's the command of a king, well, we don't like kings anymore, so it's the good of society. They didn't have an individualism, a real individualism way station, such as she suggests existed in the 19th century in America, at least to some extent.
Yeah. Don, do you have any comment on the differences between the American 19th century and Europe? Or no?
No, I mean, I agree with what James said. I think the only thing I would add is that part of what she thinks is going on is that, so you get this grasp of individual rights during the Enlightenment, and it gets embodied in the American system into the founding of the country, right? And that happens in basically the last 25 years of the 18th century, and by 1800 the Enlightenment is essentially over, right? And in Europe, then it is the equivalent of a fad, whereas in the United States, it's built into the very fabric of the country, of the government, of how we think about ourselves. And so it's, even if you have during that fad some Europeans getting the concept of individual rights, it's not permeating society in the way that it did in America. So I think what James said is essentially right, that there is this whole not even grasping it, but it's even to the extent that they have it, you just have a very different context in the United States compared to Europe in terms of how influential this idea was. So, I mean, it's like, if you think about today, imagine a country that was founded on, the idea of, we have critical race theory. Let's say that, that's all in the news, and maybe 20 years from now, it kind of fades away the way that intellectual fads do. But imagine if somebody started, Wokistan, And that's going to be embodied in their constitution, that like, we the woke will be anti-racist and everything. It's going to have a very different impact than it would than in a country like this, where it's a fad and maybe it has some remnants and so on. And I think that's part of what's going to distinguish the European and the US context.
Yeah.
Even in Great Britain, a lot of land was owned by old noble families up into the 20th century. So much of Great Britain was owned by these old noble families. So even into the 20th century, this idea of wealthy people being basically barons, inheriting their privilege, if you will, was kind of stuck even in Great Britain's head. So that the idea in America, where property rights got off to a much better foundation, where you don't have these old noble families dominating real estate, an entirely different concept of individualism and property and the individual's relationship to it, I think, could be maintained. But in Europe, just the lingering presence of nobility and monarchs and a collective approach, a nationalist approach on the other side, really are the two basic ideas that are dominated really the last century in European history.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting what you brought up about British society, because I find it fascinating how people identify themselves as members of classes that do not correspond to their incomes anymore, or their kind of wealth, or their achievements in life. So people, it's almost a tribal thing. They will say, "Oh, I'm middle class," or I'm working class. Well, but you're not working. You're actually living off wealth that you made. Yeah, but I'm working class because my parents were working class, and or I'm middle class, but they're actually quite poor. So they see it as part of their almost born into identity, rather than anything that can be achieved. Which is, I do not believe in classes anyway of people, but if you are born into it, it's wrong.
In America, as Ayn Rand often would point out, the saying from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, right? In just a couple of generations, really, truly 3 generations. In America, that's the way it really goes, at least until quite recently, where social mobility has been declining quite a bit in this country. But really, social mobility is what characterized American history. And you'd see people going in, and families that will go into and out of wealth and poverty in just a matter of a couple of generations.
Yeah. Now, I understand in this essay that the nature of capitalism is underpinned by the principles of individualism. But when I bring up individualism in discussions I have with other people, one of the challenges that I'm getting is, look, even in capitalism, you need cooperation. You need to work with others. If you go to work in a big company, you have, thousands of colleagues that you need to put your heads together and think about some problems to solve them. And, each person does something different. How can you be an individualist when you work as part of a team? What would be the best answer to this? Just so I can compare my answer to yours.
Well, I mean, every concept depends on its contrasts, right? And so what you're distinguishing individualism from is not cooperation. Like, there's no cooperationism. You're distinguishing it from collectivism. And what's the distinction? Well, clearly, if you're arguing for individualism and capitalism, it's not like everybody sits in like a forest and doesn't deal with other people. It's precisely. You're building companies, and you're building big ones, and you're having all sorts of relationships, including contractual relationships with other people. But it's all, you decide independently what relationships you're going to enter into and on what terms. You're cooperating. Whereas collectivism is all, you don't set the terms, and the goal is not for you to benefit. The goal is that you're there for the good of the group. And maybe sometimes you win, right? Like, If the tribal pot gets really big one hunting season, you're going to get a gnaw on some deer meat. But that if you need to be thrown into the tribal pot because there's no deer to be found, well, then too bad for you. And that is the difference. The difference is what is your ability to choose the kind of arrangements that you engage in, and the idea that you should be the beneficiary of those, and that you're not. And what collectivism says is that no, you don't get to choose, and your benefiting is at most incidental or a happenstance or a side effect. It's the group owns you, and the group is what should benefit. And then even more deeply, there's a whole view of part of what, if you have this conversation, will ultimately get pushed to is not just like, should you cooperate, but does the individual actually have any efficacy, and can the individual create anything? And so collectivism has a metaphysics in effect, and there's a whole denial of individual efficacy. And that's part of what Ayn Rand is doing in rooting an understanding of capitalism and reason, and stressing that reason is a faculty of the individual. She's saying in order to think about all of these questions, it comes down to your view of man. And the collectivist view of man is that you don't have a mind, you're not able to operate in reality independently, and therefore, as a consequence, we need a social system that treats you as an appendage and a piece of the whole that has to operate on its own terms and for its own good. Just as you as a human being, it's not that you're subservient to the cells in your body, they're subservient to you, and you have to cut off some cancer cells to live. Well, then too bad for those cancer cells.
Yeah. Oh, this is the classic canard, isn't it? It's the choice is not a question of whether we live on a desert island as atomized individuals versus living in some society at all. That is a total false alternative, and a complete gross misunderstanding of the free market. Free market is all about organized human behavior. It's all about cooperating with other people. We were discussing a while back, whether you could define capitalism as the system of competition. Well, no, you can't, because it's not essential. One could make a better argument, it would seem to me, although it's still a non-essential, that it's the system of cooperation. It's a system of organizing businesses and, starting organizations, working with people, buying, selling, working through agents of various kinds. The question isn't about whether humans will organize and coordinate their behavior. It's a question of whether that coordination will happen voluntarily or at the point of a gun. As Don points out, Ayn Rand's basic argument is that when guns come out, brains shut down. The only guy whose brain matters is the guy who's holding the gun. If I'm holding a gun, on all of you that are involved in this conversation, your brains don't matter. Your brains don't matter. So your basic tool of survival is negated. I have, in effect, cut off the mechanism by which you survive as an individual. That necessarily destroys the use of reason in society, just as it destroys your capacity to use reason. That is the basic moral justification for freedom. Freedom is the basic condition that allows the operation of reason, our basic tool of survival. To the extent freedom exists, reason will be operative in society. To the extent it does not, reason will be shut down.
One of the main criticisms of capitalism that I hear, and this is not really present in this essay, but it is kind of quite prevalent, is that in capitalism there are a lot of non-productive jobs or ways to make wealth without being productive. Here, the essay says production is the application of reason to the problem of survival. Now I work in finance, and I get this challenge a lot. They tell me, well, what do you produce, George? Well, I mean, you just work in banking. You pretty much make money out of money. This challenge seems to be quite pervasive. Like society seems to be enamored with the idea that bankers and financiers are parasites, in effect. And they also say that about advertising and about other professionals, but mainly it happens with finance. And I know that Don has co-authored a whole book about this. So I would like him to make a comment specifically on this, if possible.
So you have to think about what capitalism is. And well, obviously we're talking about that, but one aspect is that all relationships are voluntary. And so the question is, well, who's paying all these people with unproductive jobs? Who's choosing to, give them wealth? And if you look at finance, I mean, that helps really clarify things. It's not like the government is just handing you a paycheck and saying, "Oh, we really love your, gambling skills," or something like that. The fundamental role of finance is best, I think, thought of in analogy to the fundamental role of energy, right? Like you could say energy makers don't make anything, right? Like, it's the car makers who really make stuff, and it's the people who create light bulbs, and they provide the fuel that powers every other thing in the economy. And what finance is it's, in effect, you could think about it as the financial fuel. It's giving us the resources to do productive things. Now, there's more to it than that, and so one of the things that is true. So, if you take something like the stock market, is that fundamentally it's about funneling resources to the most productive companies and away from the least productive companies. Now, it's true that part of what that does is it allows people to make money in ways that are not obviously productive. Like, what is a day trader doing? Now, you can explain that there is a productive role in terms of price discovery and things like that, but it's more that but that's kind of a secondary issue. What you have to get first is that the industry is fundamentally productive. And that's the thing. Like, I'm much more sympathetic to people who go, I don't really understand how a day trader is doing anything productive. I'm not sympathetic if they're questioning the productive function of finance as such, which I think is, there's no question that it's a tremendous value. Because, I mean, what it's doing is it's taking savings, it's taking wealth that's been produced and putting it to its most productive uses. So that instead of all right, well, you produced and you stick some money under your mattress, or you could think your neighbor comes along or your son-in-law and says, hey, I need a loan. Instead, we're getting all that savings channeled not by happenstance, but to the most productive places in the economy. And that is a tremendous benefit. And I mean, you can see the way that plays out if you look at history. So if you think about, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we get these rise of these large conglomerates that then, when they're facing international competition from places like Japan, we're realizing, oh, these are dinosaurs that aren't actually able to be very efficient and very productive. And it's finance that basically helps them get taken over, broken up, put in the hands of people who are going to make them incredibly efficient. And that's why our auto industry today is way better than it was, 30, 40 years ago. And that was all mediated by finance.
Great. Thank you, Don. I'll use that whenever I get challenged about my work in finance. So I'll take a couple of questions from the chat. One of them is asking, they're saying currently capitalism is considered a cursed word. Should we insist in re-owning the word, or should we use alternative term like free market or laissez-faire? Is there any point in insisting on using the term capitalism?
Well, I don't think you could use free market or laissez-faire, because if you, Ayn Rand is stressing that when she's talking about capitalism, it's a social system, and that includes a legal system, includes an economic system, it includes a certain kind of political system. It's a wider concept than just the economic aspect of it. So free market, I think, is too narrow. Now, I would say that unlike like selfishness, which is a word I think you have to fight for, I'm not convinced that capitalism you have to fight for. You have to fight for the ideas, and I don't think changing the word necessarily gets you that far. But I do think it's precisely because it's a well, let me put it this way: I'm open to better things than that. It's an ugly word, but the kind of Deirdre McCloskey talks about innovationism. Again, that's more. It's a little too economic. I think, like in most in certain contexts, I'll talk about just liberty or freedom or something like that. But until somebody comes up with a better word for the social system, then I think it's important to clarify. And I don't think but I don't think it's like I don't think it's craven appeasement to search for a better word.
Privatism, could that work? I don't know.
Well, no, because that has a little bit of the flavor of being anti-government.
Yeah.
Like I'm not for there's privatism sounds like, well, we want everything to be private and maybe we'll be compromisers and allow the government to be public or something like that. Whereas our whole view is that in order to have a functioning social system, the government is crucially important. You need laws and you need these things. So I think that it's very hard to come up with the right word. But I think like liberty and freedom are good. Again, they're vague in today's context and misunderstood. So no word is going to solve the problem of helping people get clear on what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I think that's the point. The point is the discussion and the meaning. Capitalism was the pejorative term really coined by Karl Marx, seized on, right, and accepted, with relish by defenders of capitalism and to some extent. But the term is not really the essence here. The term, it's the meaning. And the term has come to be associated with all sorts of things, like crony capitalism, more of a fascist model of economics than even a free market model of economics. But it does have to refer to the social system, as Don says. So until we have a better system, a better word, the word liberalism, it's really a shame that the word liberalism has been so badly abused. Because originally that's the idea, wanted to get to the point of abstraction at that level, at the level, say, of liberty. And it's just been taken and, of course, chewed up and used by people who have no interest in liberty. That's a shame.
Yeah, and I like liberalism too, although I don't like classical liberalism. I know why people do it, right? For the reason James said, that has been the meaning has changed. But classical makes it too much as we want to go back. Whereas really the best term is that we're for progressivism. I mean, so it's every good term has been co-opted. Right. And so I'm against anything that has the flavor of backwardness, which is one reason why I'm open to replacing capitalism, because it so much has the coinage of how people thought about freedom in the 19th century. And I think we see that in the Britannica article, right? Like we think there's these defined classes, which was way more plausible then, that you had labor and capital. Whereas now, who doesn't have an IRA, right? Like everybody is labor and capital. I mean, it's the whole categories there just don't even make sense. So, yeah, if any of you who are really good at inventing words, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, if you have a really good word, make it a super chat, and then we will definitely get to it. The other question I have is from Fabian, and he asked, how well was capitalism understood in the 19th century? Are the horror stories about monopolies and robber barons purely retrospective revisionism, or were they understood that way also at the time?
Oh, they were understood that way at the time. But take Rockefeller. John Rockefeller really is the one who gave the world petroleum products. And, they had been out there before, but he reduced the cost. He made them widely available. He made them so cheap that they could start fueling an industrial economy. And the idea is that since he had taken over basically the market, was putting himself, he wasn't even the sole provider yet, but he was getting to be the position where he was going to dominate the market. That idea alone, the idea that there would be one guy who'd be providing oil, was thought to be dangerous and wrong and too much power in one guy's hands. And so that was the cause, really, that stimulated the antitrust laws in the late 19th century in this country. But Rockefeller himself didn't really engage in what we would call monopoly abuses. What he was doing was making petroleum more and more widely available by making it cheaper and cheaper for everyone. So in terms of abuses, when people think of capitalist abuses and robber barons, we've had the earlier discussion about robber barons, really the abusive types were the ones who were getting government help, such as the heavily subsidized First Transcontinental Railroad. Of course, it in short order went bankrupt, had to be basically rebuilt, right? Within, though, a couple of decades, J.J. Hill, basically without any government help, built a transcontinental railroad, completed a transcontinental railroad, a railroad that did not go out of business, one that fed and created all kinds of industries in the region. So people at the time had a bad understanding of what was going on. You think in Great Britain, think of the sort of the cliched Charles Dickens novels, you know, the horrible miseries of child labor and people in the early British Industrial Revolution. Again, they misunderstood what was going on completely. All they could see as a rising middle class was getting more and more prosperous was that there were these poor children who were working these long hours. They had no historical perspective that they brought to it. Those children's lives were literally saved from death by starvation because of those jobs.
Yeah.
They didn't really have a context for it, but they did have all kinds of Christian and collectivist and altruist assumptions that they brought to the world. And they had a confusion. And here Ayn Rand is really key in her distinction between economic and political power. They really did not understand that distinction well at all. And so if John Rockefeller was becoming, the first, billionaire or equivalent, that in itself is a bad thing.
So one place that Ayn Rand talks about this is in the title essay For the New Intellectual. And part of her view is that, reality does not speak for itself. You need people to explain, understand, okay, what's going on and how should we think about it? And her view was during the Industrial Revolution, you had the biggest change in, at least recent, as in millennia history, in the way that human beings were living, a completely transformed way of living. And that instead of struggling to bring clarity to what's happening and why it's a value, people didn't try to explain it or tried to explain it away or damn it, as James was talking about. And that part of what made that plausible is that, these were not, it's not like you walked into these pristine cities filled with rich people. It was, you had people fleeing the farms and congregating in really dirty, awful conditions compared to what? Well, compared to what you would want them to be. But if you look at it, this is why the individualist perspective is so important. It's nobody forced those people there. They viewed this as better than what they came from. And if you actually, what's the word? You can, if you've never worked on a farm, particularly if you think about a farm before technology, you can have this kind of, oh, everything's green and we're kind of out in the sun. It's for many people hell on earth. And this was a way out of that for the first time for the masses of people. And so this does not mean that we should look at those conditions and go, oh, that was great. And there were kind of real abuses that happened to people. In the same way you can think about in a modern context, Hollywood, right? Like people really want to be a part of Hollywood, and people will take advantage of that and say, oh, well, if you sleep with me, you get into this film, and we can have a really low moral opinion. And if you imagine like this immigrant who has nothing and a landlord or an employer is, mistreating them, you can have a really low moral opinion of that. But you have to compare it to everything that came before and to the other alternatives, not to some utopia that you dream up in your head. And this was a step forward, and we're continuing to make steps forward. And insofar as there were real abuses that I think are deeply problematic, a lot of it is you didn't have full capitalism, the full protection of rights. So, I mean, there were workers who I think their rights were being violated by bosses, and that was wrong. That shouldn't have happened. And of course, if you get into the situation with women and minorities, I mean, there are a lot of problems. But what we would argue is that part of what it means to understand capitalism is to be able to distinguish, all right, what were the elements that capitalism was responsible for, and what were the elements that government controls were responsible for. Jim gave the really good example of, cronyism. It's like and the Ayn Rand called them the money appropriators, the businessmen who get rich by government. That's a crucial distinction. And one of the things Ayn Rand talks about in, I think it's The Intellectual Bankruptcy of Our Age, but one of her early Ford Hall forums, if not the first one, is that one of the things that a historian needs to do that hasn't been done is give a full account of, all right, what was capitalism responsible for? What was the legacy of government controls responsible for? And we have more of that today, but no, I still think there's a lot of work to be done there.
Agreed. And I want to just emphasize what Don said there is absolutely critical for understanding the history of capitalism. The three most important words to ask when evaluating any of these things is compared to what? Are compared to what?
Yep. Yeah. Definitely. These arguments lack historical perspective, as you said. And in particular with the children, these children would, if they had been alive, they would probably have been working in a farm, and their conditions would have been a lot worse. And if anything, nowadays, because we're judging them by today's standards, but what made it possible for children nowadays to be able to go to school and to not have to work until they become older is the wealth that was created by the capitalist system and by the industrialists. So
extraordinary luxury the Industrial Revolution and capitalism created to say that children don't have to work, huh?
Yeah.
Completely unprecedented and unknown in human history until the last 2 centuries.
Most people think it's because of government regulations, that is the regulatory framework that made it possible. But
there is no regulatory framework 500 years ago that could have made it possible.
Yeah.
Simply a question of a more productive economy.
Yeah.
Oh.
Further down in the essay, we have a sentence which I've noted. It's a rational mind does not work under compulsion. It does not subordinate its grasp of reality to anyone's orders, directives, or controls. Here's the question I have. We do that all the time. We do work under controls and orders. For example, from anything, from driving our car in the streets, we have to follow the rules there, to finance and banking, right? God knows how many rules and regulations I have to consider every day at my work, and I'm still there and I'm still doing it. So I'm not sure I completely agree with that sentence unless I misunderstand it.
To the extent you have to comply with regulations is precisely the extent to which you're occupied doing something other than creative thought. If the rule is a morally valid one, banning physical force, protecting individual rights, then it's an assumption, I think, that it's in my selfish interest built in. Now, if you talking about some other kind of rule, some additional regulation that the government is imposing on us, every single one of those is a distraction from the creative thought that should be going on. In fact, will occupy an increasing amount of the mind space of every businessman and woman out there. So yeah, to the extent you have regulations, you've crowded out creative thought. In fact, you've frozen and fossilized the economy in place to that extent, right?
Yeah.
No, the force and mind are opposites. It's as simple as pointing a gun and negating your mind, but more than that. The mind needs to be free, right? It needs to go where the mind will take it. I have to follow the evidence and logic and my best judgment. Anything else is something other than reason,
Yeah.
right? To the
So
extent
it's a
that occupies my mind, I'm not going by reason.
so it's a matter of degree, right? So we say when she says a rational mind does not work under compulsion, if there is limited compulsion, then your rational mind works to the extent that it's not forced in certain aspects. And the more the regulations, the less you can use your own judgment. So, for
Precisely.
example, in assessing credit risk, that is what I do, or in reviewing credit risk, the more I have to follow certain guidelines on how to do it that are government imposed, the less innovative I can be in this process, and the less time I have and the less effort I can put into making a difference in my job.
Exactly. I worked at an electronics factory when I was a teenager, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration would regulate the distance between the toilet bowl and the seat of the toilet. And here you've got people actually have to spend man hours, right, going around making sure that the toilet bowls are and the toilet seats are this far apart because some OSHA inspector could come in and fine the company. To the extent that the electronics company, now think of that, to the extent some electronics company businessman or woman is having to think through that kind of an issue, they are not allowed to use reason as they selfishly should be allowed to use it, right? It's a distraction. It's crowding out reason.
Yeah. Don, any comments on this?
No, I think that hits it.
Yeah. Great. So later on, let me see. Later on, we have a definition of capitalism, which is the following. Capitalism is a social system based on the recognition of individual rights, including property rights, in which all property is privately owned. Does she mean all property, or are there any categories of property that may not be privately owned in a capitalist system? Does she really mean the all were there? And I'm thinking, for example, I don't know, weapons or things like that or even something simpler, a challenge that we roads, public roads. Would it be possible to have all property private, and then how would it work to have private roads? I mean, could you exclude people from using certain roads? Where would that lead?
Well, I think there's two different questions there.
Yeah.
So one is an issue of defining the system, and then it's evaluating, well, is that really going to work? And I think that, in a certain sense, it's getting into a little bit of trivia and wordplay, but I think the view is that like property, the government has certain things necessary to carry out its function, right? Like there has to be buildings that they can go into and weapons for the soldiers and things like that. And it's, well, do we call that property or something like that? And I don't regard that as the essential. I regard that as kind of like, all right, well, we can kind of debate the word usage. But her point is, I think, precisely that it's a system of individual rights. And I think in a better culture, you could just leave it at that, right? Like, I think the definition, if you were just an intellectual in like 1830 and you're thinking about, hey, there's this new phenomenon that we've seen since the birth of liberty, and I'm going to call it capitalism. It's the system based on individual rights. But now a definition has to be able to distinguish things clearly in your mind. And so it's, well, we have to distinguish this from socialism, amongst other systems, right? Or feudalism and things like that. But particularly from socialism is the main kind of distinction you have to make. And so socialists would say, oh, we're for individual rights too. and they'll often put it human rights, not property rights. And so you have to emphasize and bring in, no, we're for property rights. And what if it's, well, yeah, we're for property rights too. It should just all be publicly owned property, public property rights. And it's, no, we're talking about a system where it's individuals who own property. And then it's kind of a sub question of, well, how do you classify government resources and so on? And then I think it's a separate question for roads. So, I mean, James, if you want to take that one, feel free.
Well, Ayn Rand definitely believed that roads should be privately owned. There shouldn't be public parks, public roads. The functions of government, she is very clear and specific about: police, courts, armed forces to protect the country. They obviously will need training facilities. They will need to purchase weapons. They will need all kinds of stuff. How we classify that, as Don says, as property or not, is really a marginal issue, because it's really a marginal issue. Now, as for roads, there are all kinds of ways. Various systems of private road have actually been operative in the world. People don't realize that. People don't realize that private roads have been working well in private communities in this country and elsewhere for some time. And it is in the interest of the road owner to allow us all the access possible, right? It would make very little sense to have a road that wasn't generally open for access. You say, well, who pays for it? How can you pay for it? Well, there's all kinds of technical answers you can give that. In Hong Kong, for example, they have magnetic registers that can tell you how many miles you've driven on the road and can bill you at the end of the month. There are all kinds of technical answers to these questions, but there's no technical reason why all the roads can't be privately owned. Would that mean that some communities would be restricted, would have restricted access? Yeah, of course some communities would have restricted access. That'd be in the nature of private roads, but it would be the property owners there, right, who determine that issue.
Yeah, and
if I was a property owner, though, and was using the road, I would want every form of travel possible.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be in my interest to restrict access to homes and businesses. Quite the opposite. My interest would be in maintaining the road so that people would have access. That's what I'm making my money on, is providing access.
And as a road user, you could choose between various options, various roads. Some roads would be cheaper, and therefore they would have traffic jams potentially, and you would be delayed on your way to work. Some other roads, if you're in a hurry, you could pay a bit more and go there quicker.
We do have, for example, toll roads run by the government, and they do have less traffic, and you have to pay a specific toll. But traffic jams, in my view, are a direct result of government running the roads. Environmentalists, for example, where I live in California, think that if you don't build roads, you discourage development. Of course, the development happens anyway, and they just haven't built the roads, so that you get traffic jams. It's government mismanagement of the government ownership of those roads that creates traffic jams in the first place.
Great. Now, later on, we have another quote. It says, in a capitalist society, all human relationships are voluntary. Men are free to cooperate or not, to deal with one another or not, as their own individual judgments, convictions, and interests dictate. They can deal with one another only in terms of and by means of reason, i.e., by means of discussion, persuasion, and contractual agreement, by voluntary choice to mutual benefit. And here's the question I have. Okay, what if a baker doesn't want to bake a cake for a wedding that he doesn't agree with? For maybe reasons that he's discriminating against his customers. He says, okay, I really don't want to make a cake for customers that I don't agree with. Or what if a landlord refuses to rent to individuals, let's say Greeks like me. He says, okay, I had bad experience with Greeks before. I'm not going to rent to Greeks anymore. And I'm stating this in my advertisement. I'm saying, please, no Greeks should apply. Or even an employer, if an employer doesn't want to hire a certain race because he's bigoted, he's a racist, right? How would it be? How would this work in a capitalist society? How would we defend ourselves against such business decisions if everything is done on a voluntary basis?
So I actually think this is a really legitimate concern that people raise. And it's, I think, a hard view to get why we think that that should be allowed. And I think if you think of the argument, it's at a pretty high level of abstraction. Because what is the argument? The argument basically is this means the government gets to decide what are moral choices and what are immoral choices and impose that on people. And yeah, maybe some of those choices I would agree with, right? Like I would agree that you shouldn't discriminate against Greeks. Um, now, now Brits, that's a different issue. But that is catastrophic. I mean, that is unleashing the power of government. Essentially, it says to do whatever it wants. It's or whatever the majority wants, or whatever the politically powerful wants. It's the end of individual freedom to say we're going to decide that some voluntary choices are off the table because we think they're immoral. That's imposing the content of morality at the point of a gun. But then you really have to think there's more to say, right? Part of what you can say is, well, there's incentives in a free society not to do that. That is, you'll be punished economically for discriminating against good people. But I think there's even more to say than that, which is, I mean, we saw in the United States, set aside even government enforced discrimination. It's actually, if you were a Black person in the South 60 years ago, or I mean, what would it be? In the 40s and 50s under Jim Crow, even if you set aside the discrimination, I don't think it's true that like a white person discriminating would pay a price. And again, I'm saying like, even if you removed the actual government enforcement because racism was so popular and so widely accepted. And there, I think you do have to have things to say about like, that's partly why I'm not just for capitalism. I'm for individualism. I think you morally have to do everything necessary, everything within your power to persuade people that kind of thing is immoral. And part of it means using your economic power. It's like, I'm not going to deal with racists. I'm not going to deal with people who engage in that kind of discrimination. And part of it is moral suasion of denouncing that sort of behavior. And so I think it's both of those. You have to get why you lose something tremendously important by giving the government the power to decide that certain kinds of voluntary arrangements are off the table. And then you have to have something to say about what's required to fight immoral choices in a free society.
That's
I much agree with that. I'd add that Ayn Rand observes that when you do have freedom, then the mind is free to operate. Reality tends to win. Reason will tend to win in a free market. That is to say, if you want to be irrational, be a racist, or whatever other irrationality you want to indulge in, to the extent you're being irrational, you will necessarily pay a price in a free market economy. There will be a tendency toward reason and reality winning because people are free. To the extent they're not free is, of course, to the extent to which you'll distort that. You'll distort reason and reality being the standard, because now you've imposed some arbitrary rule. In the case of racism, it's really clear. Racism is irrational. But in other cases, it's really not so clear that a regulation at all could even be effective. Is the regulation itself even plausible on the face of it? And in most cases, no. For example, the baking of the cake issue with gays. You could say well, this person has profound moral issues that are irrational, and they'll pay a price, right? But the greater value, as Don points out, is the freedom. And my mind needs that freedom. As we were saying earlier, it needs the full scope of being irrational. If I'm not free to be irrational, I'm not really free. If I'm not free to make bad decisions, the whole point of the progressive nature of capitalism is that it's open to new options. And those new options, never before discovered ideas, will only be out there and available if people have the full range of choices, including all of the irrational choices.
Yeah. And I mean, let's keep it on the race thing for a second. Because I think, again, because this is so plausible to good people, that I think you have to really think it through. So if we just, it's not just a slippery slope argument exactly, that, well, if we allow, if we take away the right to discriminate against people on the basis of race, then it's going to, lead to X, Y, and Z. But even what does it mean to discriminate against somebody on the basis of race? And how do we know that they're doing it? So one of the big debates today is, well, what is racism? And there's some people who think, well, it's basically any time that outcomes are different than the proportion of basically if outcomes are unequal at an aggregate level. And so, for instance, if you run a programming company and you have fewer than, I forget exactly what the demographics of the US are, but I think it's like, if you have fewer than 13% Black individuals who are there, and if it's not 50, 149 or 50-50 men and women, then you're discriminating, you're engaged in racism. And so the government's going to come in and dictate like what you can do. And I think that people would say, well, that's crazy. I mean, I worked at the Ayn Rand Institute, and as a, essentially a WASP, I was a complete minority. Everybody else is Jewish and or Canadian. And so the idea of, well, the government has to come and rectify this would have been the complete obliteration, of ARI. And so the point is that anything that requires rational judgment can't be coerced. And that's the point that James was stressing, that Ayn Rand is stressing. And what I'm trying to stress here is that you need to get beyond making that at a very high abstract level, that if we're talking about persuading people, you have to be able to explain at this fine-grained level why they themselves would see it as a disaster. So, I mean, for example, I'm seeing in the chat, Stephanie is making a good point in that, she says the way to handle it is to tell others, hey, this guy wouldn't hire me or rent an apartment to me because I'm Greek. Then others might boycott his apartment or factory. But it's the property owner's right to refuse service. That's right. That's the position. But I think I can really understand how people are bothered by unjust outcomes. And what you have to explain is that that giving the government this power would be more deeply unjust and detrimental to the things that they care about.
Yeah, there's definitely examples that this happens now without even government coercion. Is this focus on identity and race and gender is so big that companies themselves are imposing racial quotas or racial or gender quotas. And I remember I was reading this email that I got from work that said something along the lines, our performance is really good, but we're still not doing well in terms of our targets, and then all our targets. And then I'm reading down and it says, well, we have this percentage Black people, only this percentage of Black people, and only this percentage of women in these positions. And then having read that, I look at myself in the mirror and I realize I'm the problem. The reason the company is not meeting its targets. So I thought, okay, do I help this organization by quitting and stopping to produce what I produce? Is this an actual target that the company would have? But this is, again, as James put it, everyone should have the right to be rational, and the same applies to my CEO who wrote this email, not my current job, previous one, and the same applies to the baker who chose to not bake that cake. And certainly the market does punish irrational decisions. For example, I hear that women get paid less than men for doing the same job. So then if you don't hire women, you are losing potentially 30% extra profit that you could be making by hiring them.
Let me quibble with one thing. So and I know everybody's speaking off the cuff. I am very much opposed to formulations like the right to be irrational. I think of it as you have the right to decide to make a decision and an assessment about what's rational. Now, in order for you to, that's what's being protected. That's what we need a government for. And now it's true that by implication, then people can act irrationally and that it would violate their rights for the government to stop them. But it's not like what I'm objecting to is this kind of libertarians will often think about it this way of like, hey man, we need the right to, do any damn thing we please and make all the irrational choices we want. And it's no, what the primary is that we're protecting the rational. And it's precisely that in order to follow the evidence wherever it leads and guide yourself by your mind, that it has to be your assessment of what the rational path is. And somebody else might look at that, and I often would, right? And think, no, that's completely irrational what that person is doing. But in order for me to be free to be rational, I can't impose that assessment on him or her.
And who knows? The mind is an individual thing. It's only individuals think. And so it may turn out that this crazy thing that my neighbor I think is irrationally doing, he'll turn out to be right. And that's what judgment is. It's allowing the choice.
Yeah.
Thinking is a choice.
We have a couple of super chats that I want to bring up before we continue with the essay. One of them is from Cobb, and it says, what if we replace capitalism with free trade?
Way too narrow.
I think we already discussed it, right? We said it's too economistic. It's not.
Yeah,
it doesn't include.
Way too economics narrow, and even there, within economics, it's too narrow.
Yeah. And then another super chat from Daniel. It says, White House used to be privately owned. Does anyone know anything about this? Do you have a comment on the White House being privately owned?
No, I mean, I have heard people talk more generally about how essentially the government would lease things and so on. But to me, those considerations strike me as just more trivial. So I don't have strong views on them. Yeah, I don't have weak views on them.
But just as a matter of history, Washington, D.C. was basically created from a grant of land to the federal government by George Washington. George Washington provided the land that Washington, D.C. is sitting on, and most of the federal district is considered, under current U.S. law, federal property.
And the third super chat I have is from Suvik. It says, Hi, Don. Thank you for your book, Equal is Unfair. I have learned a great deal from your book.
Hear, hear.
Well, I appreciate that, and I did not pay him to say that.
It wouldn't have been wrong if you did pay him, because that would have been a transaction, a marketing transaction, isn't it?
You go back to the value of advertising, right?
Yes, exactly. Okay. Then I have another part in the essay that I really liked when I read it. It says, the power that determines the establishment, the changes, the evolution, and the destruction of social systems is philosophy. The role of chance, accident, or tradition in this context is the same as their role in the life of an individual. Their power stands in inverse ratio to the power of a culture's or an individual's philosophical equipment, and grows as philosophy collapses. And it made me think the examples of Hong Kong and Venezuela. I know Yaron uses them quite a lot in his lectures, and they're really, really good, extreme examples of how philosophy makes chance irrelevant. The good philosophy makes chance irrelevant. So you have Hong Kong that basically has no natural resources. It's a tiny place, and within the space of a few decades, it became, from a fishing village, it became like one of the wealthiest parts of the world. And then you had Venezuela, which used to be the richest country in Latin America, or one of the richest. Definitely, it was very rich, mostly because of the oil industry back then. And then within, again, a few decades of the wrong philosophy taking hold of the country's government, it became a place where people have to eat their pets in order to survive. So this phrase really made me think of those examples, and I don't know if you have anything to add to these comments.
No, I mean, I'm glad you raised those examples. I think that illustrates at a political level. I'll just stress the connection to philosophy more broadly, right? Is, we talked on the Philosophy Who Needs It about its philosophy is making these assumptions explicit, and that gives you the ultimate control, not over everything in life, but everything that is within the realm of choice. It's that you can put everything in the direction of getting towards the true and the good if you have the right philosophy. And therefore you're minimizing the role of chance, you're minimizing the role of luck in life. And so when you're thinking about a social system, then it's how do we minimize the role of chance and luck and put everything in the side of the good? And again, you can't control everything, but it's what is open to choice in a political system. And in effect, that's the problem that's being solved by rights. It's that, we can't guarantee that everybody's going to be rational and productive, but if we leave them free, then the rational and productive will not just be able to function, but they will have the most power and influence in society. And this is, it's one of the most difficult concepts, probably in objectivism, but definitely in this is, Ayn Rand talks about socially objective versus economically objective value. But part of what she talks about there is the way in that context is the way in which a free market doesn't guarantee that people will be rational, but because it rewards achievement and success, it's the people who are good decision makers who have more and more influence. And you probably have seen this in finance, right? Like the better people are as investors, the more they have better information, better minds, better mental models for how the economy works. They're going to be able to move more resources within and therefore influence prices and which companies will get funded and whatnot way more than kind of gamblers who just come in or people with really irrational views. And so, yeah, I think it's a profound, it goes completely against how we're taught to think that what a free market does is it unleashes mindless short-term greed. And what it does is it gives increasing influence and power to the rational long-range people in an economy.
Yeah.
People will often say that the United States was lucky because it has all these natural resources and that's the basis of its wealth. But if that was true, then why for thousands of years did not Native Americans come up with an industrial revolution or develop the wealth that the United States, that North America would have today? It's clearly not. It's a question of the social system, and a social organization is a question of ideas every time.
We only have like about between 5 and 10 minutes to go. So, and we have quite a lot of the essay still left to go through. But there's one area that I really found fascinating, and that was where Ayn Rand describes the schools of thought on the nature of good. She goes through the common good, and she explains how common good is basically It means that the good of some men takes precedence over the good of others, with those others being consigned to the status of sacrificial animals. That is very clear. But then she says, okay, the schools of thought for the nature of good are the intrinsic, the subjectivist, and the objective. And the intrinsic is quite clear. It means that the nature of whether an action is good or not is inherent within the action, rather than by asking the question of to whom and for what. But the subjectivist and the objective are not so clear in my mind. Could you please explain the differences? Could you help us understand the difference between the subjectivist school of thought on the nature of good and the objective one? James or Don, whatever.
So, I mean, the subjective is just the good is whatever it's usually the group. It's whatever people decide is good, whatever they feel is good. You could think about in an economic context, the way that economists will often think about it is they'll just think about it as in terms of like, subjective preference or utility, right? Utility is supposedly it's whatever people happen to want, which we judge through their revealed preferences, and we're not going to pass value judgments and things like that. Whereas the objective, that's I think the hard perspective to get. You can get that the good is just kind of out there in reality, apart from individual judgment and choice. And you can get that, well, the good is whatever people feel or whatever society desires. But but the objective is, I think, a challenging concept to get, because part of Rand's view is that that values or the good, these are all species of the true, and the good and the true have to be grasped through a certain mental process. So, for instance, there's no such thing as a truth absent a person who goes through the mental process to arrive at the truth, the mental process of cognition. Well, from the objectivist perspective, there's no concept of values or the good apart from a mind that goes through the mental process of evaluation, which means that you identify a certain goal or standard you're trying to achieve, and then that becomes a measurement of, does this help me achieve it? Does this get me to where I want to be or not? And so the idea of the objective is that it's a mind that goes through the rational process of saying this fulfills a standard of value. So you're projecting goals, and then you're judging things by reference to the goal. And that's what the good is. And this is key to why you can't force the good on somebody. To force the good on somebody is to say, this is good for a person regardless of whether they go through that mental process or regardless of whatever conclusions they arrive at. And her view is that no, nothing can be good absent a mind that grasps through its own first-handed rational effort, yeah, this is good for me. This is part of my plans. And so, I mean, take something like Les Miserables, which is, an amazing novel by Ayn Rand's favorite novelist, right? And so she would say, yeah, this is a great novel. But if you just force somebody to buy it, absent whether they had any interest in literature, whether they had cultivated the ability to enjoy great literature, she would say that's not a value to them. It's not going to play a positive role in their life because they didn't go through the process of learning how to value it. And so the objective is the objective view of the good is really tied to the mental process of valuing. And it's precisely because it's a process that an individual has to volitionally go through that you can't force the good on somebody.
If you were to say, for example, to use one of Ayn Rand's examples about the lipstick, right, versus some medical breakthrough being valued. If you were to say to the consumer of lipstick, gee, that lipstick is a waste, it would be far more rational for you to put it into scientific, research for your own health's sake, right? That's not a value to her until she recognizes it. The value of the self-esteem to that consumer of having the lipstick is the greater value. But as Ayn Rand points out, if she gave no attention, she didn't go to the doctor, if she paid no attention to the other side of it, she would have consequences there too. But in each case, it's her recognition of that as a value that's key. It's a value to her because she recognizes it. And for you to step in and say, no, you're not spending enough on scientific research, you're spending too much on lipstick, that's not your call to make. It's the value to her.
But is it fair, the other one that Ayn Rand brings up, is it fair for a pop star to be making more money than a really good scientist?
If the pop star is pleasing millions of people, and if the scientist is addressing himself to a narrow community, as Ayn Rand again points out, it's not as though Einstein lacked recognition within the world of physics. It's not as though Einstein was ignored. A free market allows Einstein to get all the play in Einstein's market, and Elvis Presley to get all the play in Elvis Presley's market. It's not as though Elvis Presley's interests and Einstein's interests conflict.
So and one way to address it is that the proper level of analysis is the level of the individual, right? And so the question is not like, is it fair that a pop star earns this in aggregate versus somebody else in the market? Was it fair that I paid $1.99 for a Britney Spears song and got the Britney Spears song in return? Yeah, nobody could object to that. And when millions of people do that, Britney Spears becomes a multi-millionaire. Would it be fair to force me to pay, $199 for a microscope that I'm not, maybe I'm never going to benefit from, have nothing to do with, for some scientist in Alaska who's studying, like, I don't know, like some Alaskan bug? No, it'd be completely unfair. And so but you can ask a question of, well, how then do we assess, stepping back and looking at those aggregate incomes, the fact that there's these things that objectively we would say, yeah, like she gives, Jim talked about like the, or I don't know if you use this example, but she talks about true crime novels versus kind of great literature or something like that. And that is the whole issue of the philosophically versus the socially objective value, which again is complex and we can't get into. But the point that I want to stress here is you can ask that question. Objectivism has things to say about why it's legitimate. And Jim, with the lipstick example, gave, I think, the core of the answer. But what I'm stressing here is that when we're thinking about justice and fairness and things, the fundamental perspective is that individual transaction level. And it's really hard for somebody to say, oh, no, you should have not bought that music that gave you joy. You should have had your money taken for somebody who is offering you no benefit at all.
That's great. That really clarifies the answers to this, and it really reminded me of a person I knew living in London, an American person. He was a dancer, a professional, she did dance as an art, and she said, I don't like Republicans. I said, why you don't like Republicans? She said, because they don't want the government to fund the arts. And I was like, well, you have two options. You can either convince people and you can perform in front of a theater full of people that chose to come and watch you, and that's how you make your living, or you have to convince a bureaucrat, so you will play in front of an empty theater, but you will be paid because you convinced a government bureaucrat. What do you want? Do you want people to choose you voluntarily, or do you want to take their money by force? And that made it clearer for her, at least on that subject. And I would like to end our discussion, because it's time, with a powerful image from Ayn Rand's essay here. It says, an attempt to achieve the good by force is like an attempt to provide a man with a picture gallery at the price of cutting out his eyes. I think that is a very powerful image that clarifies exactly, even if the intentions are good, even if the outcome is actually or is philosophically good, cutting out a person's eyes or reducing, like completely blocking out their use of their own judgment and reason is it invalidates the decision in itself and its and the good that it can do. So thank you both very much. Thank you, Don. Thank you, James. Thanks to everyone who joined us on the call on YouTube and in Zoom. Thanks for the super chats. And again, I would like to say that if anyone wants to support us, please go to aynrandcenter.co.uk/memberships and become a member. And join us tomorrow on the Daily Objective, where Mark Pellegrino and Raka are going to discuss how to be less white. Maybe, maybe I need to take the training in order to be more attractive to my employers in order to help them meet their targets. This is going to be at 6 p.m. UK time. So thanks again, everyone. Have a good evening.